films in the on-demand context, which is of course an area where the traditional media don't operate anymore. We are talking about internet, online, catalogs, and it's of course the space for new rules. And I will do this looking at three main aspects which concern European legislative reforms happening right now. A first aspect concerns the promotion of European works. So what can be done in order to ensure that these works are actually being encouraged? Another leg is how to improve the circulation of these works from the copyright point of view. And I'm very happy that Mr. Grigoriev mentioned the Russian framework of the regulation online. You might have seen there are some reports outside. These are free, are available for you. And these are the legal publications that we provide with my department on the Russian legislative framework. So you will find there one on regulation online and another one on exceptions to copyright, where quite some focus is put on the Roskomnadzor's activities, the federal government, and the jurisprudence that we have there. Last aspect I will dig into is how to ensure cross-border circulation of the works. So which types of systems are being put in place in Europe, and with a warning that these are still reforms that are being discussed. But before that, I wanted to invite you to have a look at a map. A map is always it was a good starting point to understand that compared to Mother Russia, Europe is relatively small, and with many small countries. There are 28 members and 24 languages. So you might imagine that when it comes to films and their circulation, language is of course a very important aspect. Not only these are countries with their territories, and territoriality is another factor that is very important. And territoriality is exactly what is being questioned right now. What do I mean with this? First of all, that from the licensing point of view, the film industry is very peculiar. It is traditionally being exploited on a territorial basis. So, of course, each distributor buys the rights for the exploitation of the film in a certain country. But then the internet doesn't have the geographical borders. So then a first issue happens when you have, for example, big buyers that buy for a more pan-European context, and what is going to happen there. This is not always easy because copyright rules, they are harmonized in a certain way within these 28 member states, but then you have many local national variations on the theme. And the right holders, of course, they are also not obliged to license the content. They can also decide that they want to be selective in the countries where they distribute their works. So this can also be something that explains why in some countries you can see a film and in other ones you cannot. But all this is now being a bit questioned at European level because territoriality is by some stakeholders being seen as an obstacle to the free market, to the free circulation. So it's being challenged. On the other hand, you have another issue. You can have non-EU operators, and we heard from Mr. Grigoriev that you have here in place some special rules concerning the shareholders of the companies that are allowed to operate in Russia. We don't have that in Europe, but we have still the case of pan-European, let's say, big players that are non-EU based, let's say from the US, that buy and present their works in the EU in the various member states. You can also have member states that decide to target other member states. So the borders are really being challenged. And all this is being now addressed by some legislative reforms, which I will shortly tell you about in the next 10 minutes. And also to set the scene in order to also give better understanding of the market figures that Gilles will show you in a while. So let's have a look at these new rules coming from Brussels. The first leg I wanted to briefly introduce to you is the digital single market. Digital single market means a sort of legislative fiction, let's say, where Europe loses all its borders and becomes one single market without any distinction from one country to another. Because the purpose is to ensure digital economy to flourish, ensure that stakeholders have the right conditions in order to develop their businesses. Let's not forget that the EU is born as an European economic context. So it's first of all the economic aspects that is important. And in order to create these new conditions to ensure that digital operators can operate in the most competitive ways, you have different rules being put in place. First of all, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is the most relevant when it comes to on-demand and European works. But then on the other side, you have the consumers. It's not only the operators who, of course, have to get the good conditions in order to operate, but the consumers, they must get access to these works. Otherwise, the operators could produce and produce, but if you have no eyeballs to catch, then it's quite useless. And there you have copyright reform. This means exceptions. This means easing of licensing tools. We will look into this. Portability. So when you travel around Europe, you should be put in the condition of seeing the stuff you are used to see also in another country, different from the one you're resident in, and cross-border access. We will look into all this very, very briefly. But this is just to give you a context, because the Digital Single Market Strategy was created in 2015, and regularly each year some landmarks are being established in order to see which milestones are being achieved. And this purpose is something that is regularly being assessed. But let's start with the first of these legs that I mentioned, namely the promotion of the European works on VOD. I talk about European works because that is the context of the European legislation. You are not supposed to encourage national works, but the European works, exactly because we're talking about the digital single market of the EU as such. And there are different tools in place. The first one is to ensure that there is an availability of the works in the catalog. This is really the first minimum requirement, because if the catalogs don't provide for the works, of course, then it is very likely that the whole selection might also be blockbuster driven. So since we are talking about works that need to be a bit encouraged because they express cultural diversity, traditions of the national communities, they might not always be the ones that sell most in terms of box office. So for the moment, there is a proposal in place with a 20% mandatory presence of European works in on-demand catalogs, which of course include films. And this is likely to be increased to 30% because the European Parliament wanted to give this a special boost. But that's not enough. But let's say you have a catalog with this 20%, but this is hidden at the bottom of your catalog. Nobody will ever see them. So they will not be findable. That's why you have the second rule, the prominence rule. This means that the operators providing the catalogs, they have to ensure that these works are shown. They have to get some prominence, some visibility. This can be done in various ways. You can have search tools. You can put them maybe on the front page of the web page. You can have an index system that allows you to search. You want to see, I don't know, a French film, and you can search for that, and you have them up. This is, together with the share in the catalog, something quite efficient. And then, of course, money. In the end, it always comes back to money. If there is no money, the films will not be produced, and then there is also nothing to make visible or findable. And the financial contribution obligations is something that is being quite heavily debated now, because there is, for the first time, the idea of introducing financial obligations also for on-demand. This was the case only for traditional media so far. So this is an obligation that member states can decide to introduce or not. It's not mandatory. And it can be both a direct investment into the works or also contribution to a film fund. So these three measures, they have as a purpose to encourage the presence of European works in on-demand catalogs. And if you want to read more, you can get more in one of our legal reports, so that I make a little bit of advertising also for our legal works. This you can find on our website. Second leg, the copyright package. Because we have seen, we have the money, we have the catalog, we have the prominence obligations, but of course, they need to be distributed. You remember the map and the issue of the local borders. The digital single market is also addressing copyright issues. And this from 2 points of view. First of all, negotiations. This is a quite tricky issue because there is a problem, clearly, of a balance of powers. If you have a small producer and a big distributor or vice versa, it's not always easy to have the works placed on the market. And that's why in the new copyright package, there is the idea of obliging member states to set up an impartial body in order to help negotiations to be carried out in a fair and balanced way. And this can also be seen in a quite advanced way, because these impartial bodies, which shall be set up in each member state, they can actively intervene. So just to briefly read you what is exactly being said, member states shall ensure that where parties wishing to conclude an agreement for the purpose of making available works on demand, and if the platforms face difficulties, they may rely on the assistance of these impartial bodies. And who has to pay for them? Well, this is also a tricky part, because it's up to the member states to decide who is going to pay these impartial members. And of course, this can also be a quite significant aspect in order to avoid that this can influence and bias maybe the process. But this is really quite new and innovative thing, taking into account the fact that negotiations are not always easy. And there is another aspect that is relevant in addition to this, which are transparency obligations. Negotiations are very often opaque. You never know very well how much is paid for what. You can have bundle offers, you can have certain sets of rights that are maybe bought only if you buy another 4 or 5 films. Maybe you are not very interested in them, but you are obliged because otherwise you cannot distribute the first one. All of these things, they will be now transparent, and there are also contract adjustment mechanisms. This means that if there is a disproportion in the remuneration of the works, these can be revised. This is something that is also quite new. This is concerning the renegotiation of licenses when remuneration is too low compared to exploitation revenues. This is a very important aspect, because it's of course the alia of the negotiations. You can sell at a very cheap price, but then it becomes a boost. It becomes a successful work in the box office, and then the remuneration suddenly starts to not to become that fair. And this can be renegotiated with dispute resolution mechanisms. All this is not yet in place. This will be. This is being discussed these days. There are negotiations ongoing, but I think these tools are very, very interesting and innovative. You can read a little bit more about this in a few other publications that I would like to highlight here. You can also find them on our website. One I wanted to highlight also, because the invisible operator, which nobody mentioned but is really the elephant in the room, is of course also piracy. So that's also why enforcement measures are part of the picture here. Last leg. We have the money, we have them in the catalogs because they have been negotiated, they have their visibility in the catalogs. But then what happens if you travel around and you would still like to access your works? Here you have rules on cross-border distribution. And they concern basically 2 aspects. The first one is portability. The second one is geo-blocking. Portability means that when subscribers have their subscriptions and they travel around, they should be able to see the works also in the member state that is different from the one where they are resident. This is a legal fiction, that's quite clear. It is possible only when the subscribers are known and the contracts are in place, so that these can be exactly tracked. Otherwise, you will have the classical website popping up saying that for copyright reason you cannot access the works. But the regulation on portability is exactly based on these aspects, on this presumption. You can bring with you, you can port with you the works when you travel around Europe. And this is in order to ensure that the internal market is not just a theoretical aspect. The regulation on geo-blocking is an accompanying measure as well. This means that unjustified geo-blocking is not allowed. Audiovisual media services are left out of this regulation, but of course you can imagine that there were some worries among the stakeholders. And again here, another report where you can read a bit more about these two aspects. Last, and then I conclude, is the regulation on the online transmission. This is known as the so-called SATCAB regulation. This concerns online services like streaming and catch-up. And the big issue here is something that is now being questioned by quite many stakeholders in Europe, how to ensure that when you access content online, this is not going to be blocked. And the European Commission has found a quite ingenious way of handling this, which is to presume that the country of origin principles settles all this, which means when you have cleared your rights in one member state, you get a sort of passport, a passepartout, and with this authorization, with the clearance of right in member state number 1, you can circulate around. This has nothing to do with the consumers, they are just the end beneficiaries of this, but it concerns the broadcasters. Let's say a film has been transmitted on a linear service. They want to show it in catch-up. That's a service that is usually lasting for 7 days, 10 days. It's not regulated. But for these days, if this can be shown freely, and the rights have not been negotiated in a proper way, you can imagine that the film producers are not very happy. There is a big battle going on this in the EU for the moment. So this has, for the moment, been a bit stuck in the negotiation process. But it is an attempt by the European Commission in order to ensure that the digital single market really has also works that circulate around. And this is accompanied also by another measure which concerns the collective management. So again, once you have cleared the rights, this is a passepartout for the clearance of the rights in any other country where the works are being exploited. So as you see, there are, and here again, a little report where you can find a summary of a workshop that we had in June. So just to recap, and then I'm of course available for any queries by mail or also afterwards in questions. Digital single market means 3 ways of addressing the issue. The first one is ensuring that there is a presence of European works in catalogues, money to finance them, and prominence measures to make them visible. Second leg, copyright package, to ensure that there are licensing mechanisms that allow these works to be negotiated around. And third and last one, cross-border mechanisms in order to ensure that these works are visible. And within this context, which I hope gave you an idea of the main reforms that are being discussed at the EU level, I will leave now to Gilles to complete the pictures with the services that are being developed and with market perspective. Thank you very much.